Hey, what's up, everyone? Draken back again, here to tell you that you should be watching Rodan. So, Rodan is a 1956 Japanese kaiju film brought to us by Toho and directed by Ishiro Honda, the company and gentleman who brought us Gojira, kind of kicked off and created the kaiju genre as we know it, or kind of really popularized it. This film features again the title Kaiju Rodan, who has kind of gone down in history as being one of the more iconic ones. He's up there with Godzilla himself, King Ghidorah, Mothra, Anguirus, Gigan, and so on and so forth, and will be appearing again in 2019 when Godzilla King of the Monsters. But this is, by the way, sorry for the cough. Seems like I always have one whenever I do these videos. But this is kind of the first introduction to the character, and what a lot of people consider perhaps one of the better kind of representations of him. Not to say the other ones were bad, but this one really stands out as a really classic kaiju film, both in screenplay, performances, production quality. The film looks great and is one of the high marks, especially in the early days of kaiju film, the early days of the show era of kaiju filmmaking from Toho. The film basically takes place in the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, where a couple miners have gone missing. There's reports of something in the mines killing people, and come to find out they're rather these kind of large prehistoric insects that are kind of rising to the surface and kind of feeding upon and predating upon the people in this small village. And then you kind of follow a whole kind of life cycle where you realize these insects are actually food for something else living in the mines, other ancient creatures, which eventually reveal themselves to be Rodan. And in this film, there are two of them actually, a male and female, basically a mated pair that you actually, surprisingly enough, don't see till really the third act of the movie. There's a flashback sequence in which we see a baby Rodan, which I've always kind of liked to think is the Rodan we see in the later Showa era films. But that's kind of neither confirmed nor really denied. But basically, these creatures are kind of held off, and it's kind of their mystique and their kind of mood that kind of pervades throughout the film of what these things are and what they do, and kind of the notion of, again, early Showa era kaiju films, of the idea of like ancient prehistoric creatures either returning or reawakening and kind of reemerging in the modern world. And this is very much seen in the original Gojira. Similar things that we were going to see like in Mothra, in films like Rodan, where again it's the whole idea of like ancient creatures emerging in the modern world, and kind of what effects they have on all of us, and what their presence here means to and for all of us. And one of the interesting takeaways from this film, which I kind of have to dance around a little bit because to just flat out say it is a big spoiler in terms of how this movie ends. So I have to kind of be careful what I say, because I never like spoiling these films, especially some of these classic kaiju films that I love so much, because I want you guys to go out there and watch them and check them out and kind of experiencing them, and hopefully develop an interest and a passion for them like I have. But like what Ishiro Honda did with Gojira, he didn't just portray as just an evil creature that needed to be destroyed so humanity could emerge victorious and reestablish its dominion over the world. No, rather the monsters are always depicted in a sympathetic light in this story. So that the monsters themselves are always usually a metaphor for an aspect of humanity, but also meant to be looked upon as almost tragic, because as you see them move about the world in one facet or another, you realize that they don't have a place in this world. That this world, as long as we are in it, as long as human beings are in the world will always be antagonistic to them. No matter how destructive they are, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how kind of awe-inspiring, even terrifying they are, theirs will always be a life of strife because of us. They and us cannot coexist. Not really. I think Mothra was one of the first kaiju to really, if not the first kaiju to really break ground in that sense, where she was a benevolent kaiju. Whereas all the other ones, Rodan included, have always kind of been very much of a, a clashing of worlds, so to speak. It cannot be an age of monsters if it is an age of humanity, and vice versa. So you kind of realize that these two creatures, when you see them, how they interact in the world, when you see them, how they kind of behave in the world, the acts of destruction they commit, the level of destruction they commit, and you realize it's really more of a product of their inability to kind of exist peacefully in this world. Their presence alone in the world today causes, massive amounts of destruction, loss of life. Them just flying over, a city, is basically it's like, causes like a almost like a hurricane type wind, which just levels buildings. And you see cars flipping up, people flying all over the place. Like they can't even move about the world without killing people and destroying, civilization as we know it. So they literally cannot exist with us. It's either us or them. And again, it is the tragedy of kind of how kaiju are depicted in these earlier films and kind of this early era of kaiju cinema. And this film, I think, in a lot of ways, Gojira had a very kind of film noir, almost slightly gothic horror element to it that created more of a malevolent mood. This film is much more tragic in the sense, it has, I think, a much more emotional core in the sense that you feel, by default, you feel bad for Gojira, but Gojira himself was not painted in a sympathetic light. The circumstances surrounding his being is what made him kind of sympathetic in a way, but it was more roundabout, unless you're a kid like me growing up who, no matter how they portrayed Godzilla, you just always had this huge ooey gooey soft spot in your heart for him. But in terms of kind of the portrayal, the purposeful portrayal on screen, he was much more of a dark, malevolent kind of force of destruction that was kind of became sympathetic in a roundabout way, given the nature of his atomic origins. Whereas in Rodan, the two creatures are very much purposely painted sympathetic. You are meant to feel bad for them, and it's not by accident or kind of a roundabout method of telling a story that you feel that way. It's a lot more purposeful, a lot more direct. So it's kind of a nice contrast to which at the time, really still to this day, was the benchmark film Gojira, the original Godzilla. That was the film that really like set the bar and set the standard into this day is even considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest kaiju film of all time. And no matter how good these other films that came after it we're still always very much in the shadow of that film and still are to this day. But Rodan did a very good job at portraying the kaiju in a different way. The film was in color. It's one of the early entries in color, and for Toho Cinema, it looks fantastic. The location shooting is gorgeous. The miniatures are fantastic. The tokusatsu effects, the suitimation of it looks really, really good. There's a lot of good wiring work, and the fact that you realize that in a lot of these shots, it's an actor in these suits, and how they're able to kind of make them fly, they're able to make them move, was done exceptionally well. So again, this was a high mark in terms of just the technical aspect of filmmaking when it came to making these kinds of movies. But in terms of just the performances, this film is kind of a great example of just why Toho rose to prominence in terms of making these movies. Is that they made these movies, they knew what to do with these movies, they knew how to market these films, and they knew how to make these movies really well, and they learned how to do that very, very quickly, which is why they kind of very early on became kind of the leading standard for kind of kaiju cinema, and in a lot of ways still are to this day. And a lot of the more modern films, even the films that are being made in the West today, when they're making kaiju films, they are very much still studying and learning from these older films. I mean, the newer Godzilla films that are being made by Legendary, you talk to the filmmakers of all of that, and they'll tell you that they still watch these older films, they still take notes from these older films, they still kind of let these older films take the lead in terms of kind of guiding them on how to make these movies today. They're definitely doing their own thing with them, but in no way, shape, or form turning their backs on these films that came before, these films that kind of set the mold and set the standard. And painting kaiju in a more sympathetic light was something that Toho started doing very early on, and Rodan is a very, I think, kind of shining example of how to do that very well, taking it beyond even what they did with Gojira. So in terms of really seeing a monster movie, not just a kaiju film, but any kind of monster movie really, where we are supposed to feel something for these monsters, where we're supposed to look at them and perhaps be able to put ourselves into them and ask ourselves, what if we were them? What if we awoke in a world and in a time that really was no longer ours, where our presence in it was now a hindrance to that which now, lay claim to it? What would that feel like? What would that feel like to the minute you stepped outside? The whole world was literally against you. We all get that feeling where sometimes it feels like the world is against us. But what if the world was literally against you? What would that feel like? And you realize that these two titans of the ancient world are lost, kind of two lost lovers, in a world that no longer really wants them or tolerates them. And it's like a very kind of tragic story in that sense. And it's a beautiful story in that sense. And it does a great job, again, of painting what you expect to see in the third act. There's just these two big, well, it's a surprise when you see there's two, but this destructive monster, Rodan, and you realize, oh wow, when they do arrive, it's bittersweet, because it's awesome that you finally get to see, okay, here it's what we've been waiting for, Rodan in action. But then when you see how the film plays out with them, you realize it is a bit bitter, because it's like, oh, but now that they've kind of emerged, it's, the reality is, where do they go? What do they do? And this is before Toho really started linking all these different kaiju together, cinematic universe style with Godzilla. So you couldn't, when this film came out, for all intents and purposes, it was a standalone film that didn't necessarily, exist in the same continuity as Godzilla. So it's not like, oh, well, there's other monsters out there. That, this is a world of monsters now, so their arrival is further ushering in an age of monsters, a new age where they can belong. When this film came out, as far as anyone knew, there was no Godzilla, there was nothing else. It was just them, therefore they were alone. So the later films in the Showa era kind of go away from that feeling, because it's very clear that, nope, there's kaiju everywhere, so, they're fine. They can join the club. But in these earlier films, you realize, like, wow, they are alone. They're by themselves. And the fact that there were two of them was already a bit more endearing. There were something like Godzilla, who's kind of depicted very much as like the last of his kind, or the only one of his kind, really, to, depending on how much you want to interpret the bomb affecting him. But he was alone. Whereas at least Rodan, there was two of them, but ultimately it was two, again, lovers in a world that just didn't really want them, and kind of the tragedy that is that whole notion. But anyway, Rodan, it is a classic, to say the least, and that's, you'll hear that from a lot of other kaiju fans, so that's nothing new here. But if you have not seen it, I will definitely put links in the description section below, as always, where you can go check it out, come back, give me some of your thoughts, because this is one of those films where I think just as a film, whether it's a kaiju film or a monster movie, science fiction, whatever, it's done very well. It's a great example of kind of like the triumphs of Japanese filmmaking, in terms of just the history of that industry in their country. But just when you think of how old this film is, and just you watch it, how well done it is, how well made it is, it's pretty impressive for that reason alone. So if you're just interested in a very well made movie from yesteryear, or just in general, it's definitely one to check out. If you're a kaiju fan, you probably have already seen this movie, but you never know. You could be new to the genre. Maybe some of these other films that I've recommended on this channel might have introduced you to kaiju films, and this is one you have not yet checked out for yourself. So without further ado, check it out. Got my seal of approval for whatever that's worth. And if you're just maybe a monster movie fan or a science fiction movie fan, but maybe kaiju movies is just a subgenre that you've not really explored, or maybe just haven't had much interest in before, check this one out. It's a good introduction into the genre. It's one of the classics again. And again, I think it's got a great story, a great human cast. The monsters themselves are fantastic. The special effects utilized to bring them to life look phenomenal, and while yes, being dated, look pretty damn good for dated special effects. So that shouldn't really take you out of the movie at all, if anything. But and again, it's just a damn good movie, and it's one of the reasons why I love this genre so much, because there are so many powerful installments in it that really make you look at yourself a lot more, and that's what a good kaiju film does. It works as a good monster movie, but it also works as a bit of an allegory, sometimes a lot of an allegory about ourselves. It really makes you kind of ask yourself questions about who you are, what humanity is, and kind of what humanity's role is in the world. And usually they're also just, a lot of fun. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace!